We're going to be talking about independent journalism and the role of the functions of social media. My two good friends sitting at the table include Wendy, who was a pretty distinguished journalist before she went into the much more cosy atmosphere, incredibly well-funded and protected by successive federal governments of academia, where Wendy was Professor of Journalism in the Centre for Independent Journalism at UTS.
For years, you know, we had politics in the pub, and it really was an experience that you could only get if you came to politics in the pub. I remember for years at UTS I used to get plenty of emails, can't you get a student to commit to filming politics in the pub every week, you know, as if that somehow I had an obligation to do that. And so now, you know, I would like to recognise that Cathy Vaughan does an amazingly good job of putting politics, politics in the pub on video, which is accessible to a huge number of extra people because of that. And you can even go into the archive and, you know, actually research all the topics that were on earlier on, although they're not on delivered by video.
20,000.
20,000 people see it on video. So, you know, all of us, I think, are aware of many positive benefits that have come from digital technologies. However, the power of the corporation, just like the power of News Corporation, has done so much damage to our democracy, not that we ever had huge democratic rights in this country, but certainly News Corporation has been a threat to democracy. Now Facebook, at a much larger level, is a threat all over the world, as News Corporation is itself.
Murdoch sucks!
Okay, Murdoch sucks, right? And Murdoch thinks I suck as well, because, you know, regularly I have been under attack. Not only the front page that Chris told you about, but one Saturday morning I just have been reading actually the Australian, which I haven't, I must admit, done much lately, but was reading the Australian, and I suddenly put down the front page and saw my picture at the top, and underneath it said, "What is wrong with journalism education?" And that was based on a sort of cooked up job that had been requested by the editor-in-chief, and was full of false information. Now, I take the view that I don't sue. I believe defamation is a very serious threat to freedom of communication in Australia. In my own experience, even in the last year, I've found that. But nevertheless, I do understand when people take action to stand up for their rights. Now, as I said at the beginning, I'm no expert in social media. However, I'm now using it every day, and I really encourage people to think of it in very small terms. We've all got a sort of very small reach, really, but to nevertheless use it to get whatever voice you can. Now, on my way here, I was listening to PM and listening to the report of the Royal Commission today, when obviously Shorten has been clashing with the Royal Commissioner. We all know, I think, that this Royal Commission is a political setup, but we also know that there are very real issues there about conservative unionism, which have been there for decades. The AWU have been a very right-wing union. There is a lot to be said about that, not in the forum of the Royal Commission, but we do need journalism to spell out those issues. But it seemed to me that the Royal Commission is definitely a setup because of the way mainstream media reports. The ABC is in their very balanced, best mood at the moment, perhaps going a little bit further to the right, certainly with their independence under threat. And I felt the report was sort of skewed to the Royal Commission, but that's because that's what mainstream media do. They report powerful sources, often being little more than a stenographer. And, sometimes PM can be terrific, but I didn't think it was a particularly good report tonight. So I picked up my phone and I did a short tweet. And, immediately I thought, well, what about that ICAC inquiry of all the corrupt Liberal Party donations? I mean, all those ministers had to step down, and we've had an election and we haven't even seen the report. Now, if that's not a criminal conspiracy, what happened there with the donations? I don't think I'll ever see one. Now, I know Chris thinks I'm very good at cooking up conspiracies, particularly when they're against the Liberals. But that is a criminal conspiracy. The laws were clear. You conspire to break them. Now, so I just put that out as a tweet. When are we going to see ICAC's report on the corrupt Liberal Party donations? Now, that just puts that out into the discourse. A few people will pick that up. It throws a seed out there. So, that's one of the ways that you can use social media. But I thought what could be quite interesting tonight is to take an example from a long time ago and to think of what difference social media might have made. So it's 40 years this week since a journalist, an independent journalist called Juanita Nielsen, on Friday, I think what it was July the 3rd, she was in a room in King's Cross in Victoria Street, in the room of a person who was a friend of mine, and I see Caroline down there. A lot of us knew Mick Fowler. He was a seaman. They had a meeting in his room. She was a committed journalist to the extent that she was trying to stop development in Victoria Street. Woo! They had a conversation. She was with Vic Fitzgerald, who was the president of the FEDFA, and other people. They went to the pub. They walked across the road. She went into her house. At 11 o'clock the next morning, she went off to the Carousel club, never to be seen again, murdered, almost certainly by people who were working for Jim Anderson, who was an organised crime mini-boss up there working for a bigger crime boss called Abe Saffron. And
what's that?
Anyway, I just thought, well, what difference would social media have made in that situation? Now, about 3 days after, or 2 or 3 days after she disappeared, a group of us went up to Juanita Nielsen's house where we were told that the police did not want her disappearance to be publicised. And there was a big cover-up, and it was not covered by the media. On the Monday, a friend of mine who was later killed in the United States, Teresa Brennan, I was with her and she rang. There was then a small radio station that was thought of quite highly, Triple J, I think it was Double J then.
Yep.
And we rang Double J and she did the call and she said that Juanita Nielsen had disappeared. And we did get it into the news. Not long after that, she got a threat over the phone, and that had a terrible impact on her. Now, I was thinking today, well, how different would it have been? Maybe a couple of months after that, a journalist called Tony Reeves and another person went up to King's Cross, went into the clubs, and started asking questions, and they were kidnapped and taken to Darlinghurst Police Station, where they were charged. So they were sort of kidnapped by the police. And then it was the police were completely corrupt. Now, I guess there is a huge potential in social media for reporting contemporaneously. For a start, they could have taken photos on their phone. For a start, maybe Juanita Nielsen could have sent a text. Perhaps in the age of digital media, she wouldn't have even gone for the advertising medium. Would have all been done digitally. But also, I think some things are very similar, and some things about social media are very similar, because I wanted to show you this poster, of which I think there are only about 2 copies. I can show it to Kathy later. Now, these days, if we'd been in Victoria Street, which we were, and all these thugs were there, Meissner, who's in the middle of this, he was walking along with a crowbar, sort of in a very threatening way, and eventually, there were squatters there, and a big truckload of thugs were hired out of King's Cross to come and tear down the barricades around the houses. And at the time, we took photos of all those, what we call them thugs. Probably some of them were quite nice people in another situation. But and we put them all on a poster, and we just put up that poster all around King's Cross, and probably all around Sydney, for all I can remember. Now, these days, that is really no different. And my point here is that a lot of things about social media are just in a different medium and perhaps have more spread, but the same ideas are still there. And so what you would do now is you just walk along the street with your phone, taking photos, and then that would be on Twitter in an instant, and people would retweet it. So it would have more scope, but on the other hand, Sydney was a smaller place then. So, you know, it did have even power at that time and was quite a well-known poster. And, another, I thought, example, I could give you first of all, I want to give you another example from the past. So some things are similar and some things are the same. Liz, thinking about the AWU today, I went back, I was thinking about my first experience in independent journalism after I was actually a student editor, which I was at UNSW. And this goes back to 1972, and
Take off!
Oh, for God's sake. Shut up! No, actually I was going to say go Pat Mackey, but there was then a rebel unionist, very famous person called Pat Mackey. Pat Mackey was a sort of a wobbly. If you know what I mean by wobbly, it was sort of a narco-syndicalism of a type. And he had led the Mount Isa dispute. And at the time, a lot of what that dispute was about was Pat Mackey and the rank and file AW unionists against the AWU bosses. And this sort of whole history of the AWU that we're seeing at the moment played out with Shorten does go back that far, right back to well before 1972. And there was a big story then. Now, what happened is News Corp, the Daily Mirror, absolutely defamed Pat Mackey. You know, just said he was the biggest, creep, criminal. I can't remember the exact words now, but absolutely tore down his reputation. So he sued. And a well-known lawyer at that time, some of you may have even known him, Jimmy Staples, took this case on because no one was going to take a defamation case for Pat Mackey. And so there was silence around this. There was complete silence. There was going to be a month-long defamation trial, and it was not going to be reported at all, because even then the media was very concentrated. So, I think I was looking for something to do at the time, really. And so I sat in that trial for a month and put out my own newspaper, which I then distributed to all the lawyers in Sydney. It was not expensive to print, because that was another revolution at the time. That was offset printing, which was itself extremely liberating in terms of being able to, before that, you really were dependent on hot metals. So that led to a huge explosion of communication. So I put out my little newspaper. Now, I can't even find a copy now. It's not in existence. So the whole archiving of material and accessibility of material now. But these days, I think, first of all, you would just go into that court and you would tweet the proceedings. And it would go, again, I think one thing is you can communicate a lot more quickly. I wanted to just use a contemporary example, this is my favourite journalist, not of all time, but one of my really favourite journalists is Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald is, I first came across him when he was a columnist for Salon. Now, he was then covering WikiLeaks. He's actually not he was a human rights lawyer who has become a journalist. And what I think is really interesting about Glenn Greenwald is that his real allegiances are to his sources, to his hidden sources, and also to WikiLeaks and what that's established, and Edward Snowden, and he has stuck with that, and he has been prepared to break ranks, of course, with the New York Times, who basically were prepared to sell out WikiLeaks, but also when The Guardian went a bit wobbly on all that, he went out on his own. Now, he's obviously got a big funder, and he's got a thing now called First Look Media, or The Intercept. Now, if I think back to what it would have been like, say, 45 years ago, back in 1970, you know, then when something like the Pentagon Papers came out on Vietnam, we had to wait for a long time to get that. You know, we used to wait, some of you remember that, for the alternative newspapers to arrive, you know, from San Francisco. And you know, people were just flying in and out all the time with these. Maybe occasionally they did. And there was a very well-known journalist there, who's again one of my favourite journalists, I.F. Stone. Now, I.F. Stone was quite a well-known journalist in the 30s and 40s in the United States. And then during the McCarthy period, he was really, really isolated. And he couldn't get published virtually, so he set up his own little newsletter. And he actually survived with that newsletter, and he mainly posted documents. In fact, I think there's quite a strong link between the sort of approach he took and the WikiLeaks approach. But he would analyse documents, and we would really wait for these I.F. Stone weeklies in Australia, but they, you know, they were hard to get hold of. Now, Glenn Greenwald is to me now the I.F. Stone of today, and he's got 500,000 followers on Twitter. But on the other hand, Obama's got 46 million, I think. So, you know, even he's small by comparison. But today, it's, I think, is it a year since the war on Gaza, the assault on Gaza? And so he has done a big interview with Max Blumenthal, who is a very well-known commentator on that issue. And that, you know, has just gone out around the world. And so my point here is that social media, if we can use it, can break through the silences. Because the really big thing, the really big problem created by mainstream media is the way that silences are created. And there is, you know, I don't go for people who say everything's got worse or everything's got better. Mainstream media has never been good at telling many, many stories. There's one story that I heard from a cadet who was at the Sydney Morning Herald in the 1970s, and he was out in Redfern and actually saw a cop beating up an Aboriginal person. And he came back in those days into the Sydney Morning Herald and said, look, I just saw something, it's got to be reported. And they just said, that is not a story. You know, that is not a story. And for years, you know, people were beaten up every day in Grafton prison, and it was never a story. Now, the one thing we can say for social media, I think, in its influence is to some extent in our hands that those things can be stories. Now, I'll finish up. I'm sure I should be winding up. I thought, just to say a little bit more about defamation, recently I had an experience, and this is where I think independent media like New Matilda is very important. I was just, as I spoke here a few weeks ago about the WestConnex project, and I was thinking about Tony Shepherd, who was head of the Audit Commission for the Abbott government, and he also just happens to be the chairman of the WestConnex Delivery Authority. And of course he's been associated with Transurban in the past, Transfield, which have got concessions on a lot of toll roads around the world. So, you know, this is all very interesting to me. And I came across an article in the Sydney Morning Herald, which of course I could access online, which said that he had been in court for allegedly being part of the falsification of the figures around the Lane Cove Tunnel. And there was a lawsuit going on about that. And so that lawsuit was settled. So of course that all disappeared from view and no one hears about that anymore. So I just put out a tweet. Now, next thing is I get a letter from Tony Shepherd's lawyers saying that I have defamed him, that I'm to remove that I'm to apologise, you know, costs could be involved, and this is just one Twitter. So now I'm in a really, I think, very fortunate situation of having no assets. And I thoroughly recommend that to everybody. If you can manage it and still have a roof over your head, which I am lucky to have. So I was in a slightly better position than maybe some other people. So I just kept tweeting away, and the Herald, because Tony Shepard actually threatened to sue the Herald, they were reasonably sympathetic to this, so they actually wrote an article about this, which I think was also helpful. But then what I was able to do was do a backgrounder on Tony Shepard. So this meant I just did all the research I could, as quickly as I could, packaged it up, and Chris Graham over at New Matilda was happy to publish that. Now, if it wasn't for that then goes to a much bigger audience than I can get to if I put that on my blog. Now, a much bigger one. So again, the survival of independent media is not at all dependent on, well, it is to some extent dependent on social media, but it is a separate issue, and we're not talking so much about that tonight. How can independent media survive? But to me, it's very important that it can, because there's a lot of things that can be not done in a tweet, it can't be done on a very small blog, and we absolutely do need to have independent media to be able to stand up to the threats of defamation. And believe me, as soon as you take a stand as an independent journalist, only publishing well-researched, factual information, you will start getting letters from defamation lawyers. There's another one that I had, I won't go into that because I don't have time now, but involving a Paddington Bowling Club site. I've done all that story on my blog. And again, the first time we did that story on New Matilda, this was before Chris took over, there was immediately a threat. That story, unfortunately, was taken down. So I pursued that story on my blog. Eventually there was a report, and that whole story is unravelling, and there was corruption involved with that, although the full story has still not come out. So, I guess my sum-up message just is that the thing I like about social media is I've always loved publishing, I love being independent, and I love being political. And to me, I just see social media as another part of that struggle. Thank you.